Let me now talk about this year's budget in more specific terms. The current budget proposal, the May revise that we're putting out, reflects a decline of 22.3% in revenue from the January budget. The budget we put out today is $133.9 billion general fund, some $203.3 billion overall budget. The general fund reflects a 9.4% decrease from the Budget Act of 2019. The overall budget, about a 5.4% decrease from the 2019 Act. It's important hit. Consumers obviously not able to make the kind of purchases they once were, only essential. People obviously tightening their belt. As a consequence, our revenue projections in terms of decline in sales tax revenue is 27.2%. We're projecting in personal income tax, the PIT, as it's referred to in budget language, to decline by 25.5%, and corporate tax by 22.7%. But all told, in those three main categories, a revenue decline of over 22.3%. And so we start there. That's the baseline. No longer a projected surplus north of $6 billion, but now a projected deficit for the current fiscal year and the budget year that we are announcing and advancing here today of $54.3 billion. Now, let me explain why we believe it's $54.3 billion. We cleaned up the 2018 and 2019 budget year. Not surprisingly, that showed up as a net gain of about $700 million. I don't want to lose too many of you on this, but I do want to just quickly sum up the foundational challenge that we have. So we had some good news there. But in the current fiscal year, obviously some bad news, $9.7 billion reduction in our projected deficit. And into the next fiscal year, we're projecting a $32.2 billion budget shortfall. So roughly $41.2 billion is the projected deficit. And that assumes no increased caseload, no increased costs and expenses to help the most vulnerable Californians. One cannot assume that. And as a consequence, we add roughly $13 billion to that total, $13.1 billion to be exact. Thus, the total budget projected deficit for the current fiscal year and the budget year of $54.3 billion. So that's the magnitude of what we're called upon to address. You may say, well, that's the biggest budget deficit we've ever heard in California's history. In a remarkable way, it is not. The economic consequences, the personal and professional consequences, those unemployment numbers certainly are, but the budget numbers are not in this respect. Not only do we come in with more fiscal health than we have in the past into this recession, with more ample reserves and more capacity for deferrals, the ability to borrow where it's appropriate under these circumstances. But also, we come in with a substantially larger general fund than we have seen in the past. Just to put it in statistical terms, and this is cold comfort for those watching, roughly 45% was the budget shortfall in 2003, 58% in 2009, 58% in 2009. You may recall that 2009 budget deficit came in a roughly $60 billion shortfall. 2011, it was about 30.8%, 31% of the challenge. This year, we project roughly 37%. So this is challenging. This will be trying, and this certainly will be a multi-year opportunity and effort. And I say that because I want to begin there. we are not arguing to solve a $54.3 billion shortfall overnight. We are looking not only
We are having some technical difficulties with Governor Newsom's news conference there, but he did talk about the budget, threw out a lot of numbers, and some of the numbers that are very important is saying that there is a projected deficit for the state of California of $54.3 billion. That is for the current fiscal year and also the budget year. We appear to have him back online, so let's
use
listen in.
all of the $16.2 billion in the rainy day reserve, but do it over a 3-year period. Because no matter what we do this year, it won't be enough to address the shortfall next year. And we have to be mindful of our responsibility to balance the budget every year, but do so strategically. Remember, no printing press here in the state of California. We are constitutionally obliged. It's a responsibility to submit and to approve a balanced budget. And that is our requirement through the next number of weeks. Has to be done by July 1st of this year. But again, we're looking at a multi-year strategy, and that strategy will include pulling down that rainy day reserve in a sequential way, 7.8, 5.4, $2.9 billion. I mentioned just a moment ago that the rainy day reserve is one of a number of reserve accounts in the state of California. The other reserve account was created a few years ago by the outstanding leadership of our budget chair in the Senate, Holly Mitchell. It was her brainchild to put together a safety net reserve. And thankfully, she did that with her colleagues and with leadership in the Assembly and the Senate. And the support of our administration and the previous administration. That reserve account has $900 million in it. We propose to the legislature that we use $450 million in this budget year and an additional $450 billion in the subsequent budget year. So like the rainy day reserve, we draw down over 3 years. The safety net reserve, we draw down over 2 years. So there you have 7.8. Rainy day reserve, $450 million in the safety net reserve. Finally, there was a reserve that was little noticed, but certainly hotly debated, that was probably never even imagined that we'd ever see triggered in our lifetime under the Prop 98 guarantee. And that's the guarantee that supports our K through 14 education system. That reserve went into effect a couple years ago. We started putting money in the reserve. Last year, we had $524 million in that reserve. And thankfully, we're going to pull all $524 million of that surplus in to pay down this deficit and help support our education system this year. So you have those 3 reserve accounts, roughly all totaling $8.8 billion. So that's $8.8 billion on our way to solving a $54.3 billion problem. That's nice. That's roughly 16% or so of the solution. The obvious question is, what else are we going to do? Well, we clearly have been blessed by the incredible leadership of Speaker Nancy Pelosi and the strong support, bipartisan support of our congressional delegation and Democrat, Republican leaders across this country and the president himself with the CARES Act. The CARES Act will provide us an additional 15% of relief in terms of ultimately balancing our budget. So 16% relief from reserves, 15% relief from the CARES Act. In January, I stood up here and I promoted a number of important programs, things that I think overwhelmingly were supported and certainly appeared once again to be embraced by the legislature. Focus on expanding our preschool for all programs and investment and further expanding health care to those that are currently without coverage. Series of specific proposals that we made in January. The overwhelming majority of those proposals we are now pulling back. Those are enhancements to the baseline budget. The vast majority, not all, but the vast majority we're pulling back. That represents an equivalent 15% of the solution. Reserves, 18%, federal government, 15%. The pulling back of these new programs that we were hoping to invest in January provides us an additional 15%. There are three additional categories now that ultimately get us to a balanced budget. The number one area of consternation that just a year and a half or so ago that I highlighted was some of the borrowing from special funds and some of the deferrals into new fiscal years that were done in the past. And I made an oblique comment. I said, I'm looking forward to ending these things. And first budget that I submitted upon becoming governor. But I also did that and made a side comment. I said, play the tape, because it's not unlikely that I'll be forced by conditions to come back and utilize some of those examples in the future. I never imagined to be back a year later under these extraordinary circumstances. But the ability, because we had cleaned all of that up, because we had fixed all of that, because we had tightened our belt and are better positioned to go in here, that opportunity affords us about 19% in solutions in this budget. So we're going to use a little bit of that. We think it's very strategic and very prudent under the circumstances because the magnitude of problem that occurred and manifested so quickly. So you've got the 16% in the reserves, 15% on pulling back investments from January, 15% from the federal government, 19% in terms of some of these deferrals and strategies to balance our books in a way that is well known and well described in the past here in the state of California. Again, afforded because we had cleaned a lot of that up in the past. That leaves us with two areas that more traditionally are defined in terms of balancing budgets. And that is, how do you find some revenue, and how do you define what's appropriate to cut? Nothing breaks my heart more than making budget cuts. We have been making historic investments in the last many years in the state of California, and now being forced back into this position where we are having to make cuts breaks my heart. Because one thing I know about cuts, there's a human being behind every single number. Behind every category is a dream that is either deferred, in some case, a dream that is denied. I'm sober about it. I'm not naive about cuts. 26% of our solutions would come into this category of cuts, but cuts with a caveat. And I want to make this crystal clear. We have been making it crystal clear over the course of the last many, many weeks. And that is, these are cuts that can be triggered and eliminated with a stroke of a pen. President of the United States, with a stroke of a pen, could provide support for Speaker Pelosi's new HEROES Act, and these cuts would be eliminated. These cuts would be triggered, and the language in our budget directly triggers the elimination of these cuts. It's in the control section of the Budget Act. The reason I use that in technical terms is I want you to know that's not rhetorical. We are quite literally writing it in to the Budget Act in the controlling section that if the federal government does what it must do under the circumstances to help states, large and small, all across this nation, that these cuts would go away. And when I list off, and we're going to have Keeley and my budget team come up here, and they're going to go through all the details for you, as is our responsibility and your right to know. You will hear of cuts that make none of us proud, but the values, nonetheless, we are holding on to, I think and hope will. And I'm going to get to those in a minute as proof points that that also is not just rhetorical flair. So 26% are in the category where the federal government provides the support and relief for states, cities, and counties that those cuts will not go into effect. The final point is about an 8% solution on net operating losses and tax credits that we want to tighten up. That's on the revenue side, roughly $4.5 billion of the total solution. So you add all those numbers up, you get to 100%. You add all those numbers up, what those percentages reflect in budget dollars, that's your $54.3 billion of scaffolding and architecture around this budget. But let me go back. I talked to you about values. I talked to you about what we're protecting. I want to now make that visible, make that real, not just, again, rhetorical. When we talk in terms of values, as I said, numbers change, values don't have to. Values remain. The values that not only I ran on to become your governor, but I think the values we overwhelmingly hold dear regardless of our political stripes, regardless of our time of life. Values that we hold dear, precious, on the investment in the future, investment in our children. You want to look in the eye of a child to see the mirror, the reflection of our capacity as a society. It's always reflected in the eyes of young children. Right now, those eyes are reflecting back a $19 billion impact to Proposition 98 in the education sector and in this budget. $19 billion. But I want you to know that we are not just going to roll over and accept $19 billion of cuts to public education. And let me be specific and tell you what I mean. We're going to use some $4.4 billion from the CARES Act to allow for real discretion in real time and put that money, rather than in the general fund, we're going to put it into public education, $4.4 billion, to address the issue of learning loss, to address the socio-emotional challenges that our kids are facing, the trauma and stress their families are facing because of not only lost school time, challenges with distance learning, but the anxiety induced this moment. To help with summer school and to help with the flexibility that the districts are going to need to consider on their own, on a district-by-district basis, what they feel is best for them to address the learning loss. And that includes possibly extending the school year, bringing that school year later into the summer and the like. But this will be discretionary money to substantively address some of the short-term anxiety. That's $4.4 billion. Additionally, we had made commitments. On top of this, I mentioned those commitments around paying down long-term pension obligations, our PERS and our STRS system. We're going to use one of those payments that was scheduled to pay down these pension obligations, but under the circumstances, the immediate needs, I think, require this of all of us. We're going to use $2.3 billion that was scheduled to be invested for over a 30-year period to pay down pensions to address the immediacy of the crisis in our public education system. So 4.4 and another $2.3 billion. I mentioned net operating losses. I mentioned tax credits. About $1.8 billion of that $4.5 billion revenue that would be generated would go into that 98 account, also reducing the stress. There's an additional $1.6 billion that comes independent of the state contribution in terms of the CARES Act that goes directly to K through 14. That money, $1.6 billion, obviously also goes to reduce the size of that $19 billion shortfall. You start adding this up, now we're north of $10 billion, $10.1 billion in terms of quicker solutions. Two other things we're committing to do. The deferrals also are in this category, which we believe can help obviate some of the stress related to this system. There are reserves that exist also within the school districts, and there's this very important point. We are committing 1.5% of our general fund. And I know this can be very technical, and I'm going to lose 90% of the people, 99% of you watching at home. We have something called the maintenance factor. There's a lot of complexities around how Proposition 98 was advanced to protect public education funding. And we are obvious to those concerns. And as a consequence, we are committing as a recommendation to the legislature, all of this as a recommendation to the legislature. We are committing to taking 1.5% of the general fund averaging about $2 billion a year, going up to $4.6 billion a year to do a supplemental payment under Prop 98, so that the cuts, and by the way, the $19.1 billion annualizes at about $13 billion. You can ask me a question on that. I don't want to confuse you. But with these additional supports that I mentioned and the commitment of a supplemental payment, and knowing that commitment will be made, not just advanced, of a minimum of roughly $2 billion a year, it will communicate very clearly, it should, to these districts that these cuts are not permanent. And as a consequence, make decision-making with that mindset, I think, a lot easier, more flexibility in that space. So when we talk about values in education, we mean it. But again, I'm not naive. There is a cut, the LCFF. We're not going to touch the categoricals or the supplementals. So we have an equity lens in terms of our approach, another value we hold dear. But the LCFF cuts of 10% clearly are going to be a challenge, and we look forward to working with our district, and we've already been working very closely with the Superintendent of Public Education, who has been a champion of putting front and center these concerns, not only on my desk, but our team's desk, and of course, Linda Darling Hammond, who's been working overtime to help us with these proposals as well. I just want to congratulate and thank them for all their hard work, and I recognize that work is just beginning now that the clarity in terms of the May revise is coming into a clearer picture. Let me just make one final point on education. I'll move on to two additional items and then answer questions, and then we'll have the detailed budget presentation by my finance team. I care deeply about special education, and I could not, in good conscience, be part of dismantling of a commitment we had made well over a year ago to substantially improve special education in the state of California. Nothing breaks my heart more than seeing people with physical and emotional disabilities, people so often left behind and forgotten, falling even further behind. We are not even close to where we need to be in terms of protecting those folks. And as a consequence, we're going to annualize that $645 million commitment for special needs children and not cut that in this budget under Prop 98. Forgive me for that expression. It's personal expression, not just a professional one, but it is a point of pride and privilege that, at least in this May revise, that I am not going to make that case that that budget be dismantled.